I grew up in a small house nestled in the Appalachian Mountains of eastern Kentucky. Most of my childhood memories are normal. Playing in the yard, riding my bike down dirt roads, catching crawdads in the creek behind our property. But there are some memories that still make my skin crawl, even if it's been about 20 years. My parents went through a rough patch when I was around 5 years old. I had no idea what was happening, only that they argued a lot, sometimes late into the night. My dad worked at a dealership in the nearby town, not as a salesman, so he had long hours and mandatory overtime that kept him away from home often. Mom worked part-time at the Dollar General in town and was always stressing about money. They'd fight over bills, about Dad's hours, about who was supposed to pick me up from kindergarten. Their voices would echo through our small house, impossible to miss, even with my door closed and my pillow over my head. I remember lying in bed, worried they might get divorced like my friend Tommy's parents had. Tommy had to move to an apartment with his mom and only ever saw his dad on weekends. The thought of that happening to me was terrifying. I'd cry myself to sleep most nights, my stomach in knots, wondering if tomorrow would be the day one of them would leave for good. One night, I think it was fall because I remember the sound of leaves scraping against the window, I woke up to someone tapping on my shoulder. It wasn't a gentle tap to wake me up, rather like an impatient poke that startled me out of my sleep. When I opened my eyes, I saw a figure standing beside my bed that looked like my mom. It was dark, so I couldn't see her face clearly, but I recognized her shape and her hair. She was wearing what looked like her nightgown, a long white thing that reached her ankles. She didn't say anything, but she curled her finger in a come here gesture. I was confused, but I got out of bed like she wanted. My room was cold, much colder than it should have been with the heating on. The figure walked over to my window, which was already open about halfway. Now, that struck me as odd even then because I never opened my windows. They were old wooden sash windows with peeling paint, nearly impossible for a kid my age to open or close without help. The wood would swell in the damp weather, making them stick, and the counterweights inside the frame were broken, so you had to hold them up with a stick if you wanted them to stay open. The figure gestured toward the open window, beckoning me to follow. I remember looking around my room, wondering if I was still asleep and dreaming. My Batman nightlight was still on, casting just enough light to see shapes, but not details. My digital clock read 4 a.m. When I looked back at the window, she was already outside, her upper body visible as she leaned in, still motioning for me to follow her. I approached the window and started to climb out. The sill was at chest height for me back then, so I had to really hoist myself up. I remember the rough wood against my palms, the cold night air hitting my face, and the strange silence outside. And that's the last thing I remember until the next morning. I woke up sometime later to my parents yelling. I was lying on the ground outside, right below my bedroom window, curled up in the mulch of my mom's flower bed. The fall wasn't far. Our house was a single story, but I was confused and disoriented. I was freezing cold, too. My pajamas were damp with morning dew, and there were small scratches on my arms and face from the holly bush I'd apparently landed in. When my parents found me, I asked my mom why she wanted me to sleep outside last night. The look on her face is something I'll never forget. Pure confusion with traces of fear. The poor woman had no idea what I was talking about. My dad picked me up and carried me inside while Mom checked me for injuries. They kept asking how I got outside, if I'd climbed out the window myself, if I'd been sleepwalking. I just told them Mom came to my room and told me to follow her out the window. My parents were visibly shaken. They looked at each other. Then Mom said, "Honey, I was in bed all night. I never came into your room." Dad had a look at my window. It was still open, but there were no signs of damage or forced entry. For weeks afterward, they checked my window every night to make sure it was locked. And eventually, Dad nailed it shut. As I got older, I mostly forgot about that incident. My parents worked through their problems when I was around 7. Dad got a better job with better hours, and they started going to marriage counseling at the church. By the time I was 12 years old, they seemed happier than ever. They went on regular date nights every Friday, leaving me with my older cousin Melissa as a babysitter. When they weren't on dates, they were either working or busy around the house. Dad with yard work, Mom with cleaning and cooking. At 12, I was going through my own issues. Middle school was tough. I was smaller for my age and I was getting picked on. I didn't have many friends, and the ones I did have were starting to get into sports and girls, neither of which interested me yet. I spent most of my time playing video games or reading comic books in my room. I started to feel neglected, though I didn't have the emotional vocabulary to describe it that way back then. I simply knew that whenever I tried to talk to my parents about school or ask them to play a game with me, they seemed distracted. "Not now, honey," or "Can it wait until after dinner?" were phrases I heard daily. I felt very lonely and left out of their lives. So one Friday in late September, when I knew they had plans to go out that evening, I decided to run away. Not for real, just for a day to make them worry and maybe pay more attention to me. I wasn't really thinking through the consequences or how stupid and dangerous it would be. In my 12-year-old mind, it was the master plan. The plan was to stay up all night so I could sneak out at sunrise before they woke up. I would have set an alarm, but it was loud and didn't work half the time. I packed up some snacks in my backpack. A sleeve of saltine crackers, a couple of granola bars, and a bottle of water. I also grabbed my Game Boy Advance, a flashlight, my favorite comic book, and a light jacket in case it got cold. I didn't take much else. I was planning to come home the next day, after all, and I was a kid who didn't understand what I was doing. Around 5:30 a.m., when the sky was just starting to lighten, I snuck out the back door and headed for the woods behind our property. The morning was cool and misty, still dark enough that I needed my flashlight to see the path. Within moments, dew had soaked through my sneakers, so that sucked. I walked about a half-mile in to a spot where I could still see our house if I positioned myself right. There was this big oak tree there that I liked to climb sometimes, and I settled myself underneath it. I spent the morning playing Pokemon on my Game Boy, eating crackers, and feeling pretty pleased with myself, imagining how worried my parents were going to be and how they were going to apologize over and over for not spending enough time with me. As the morning went on, I got bored. I tried climbing the tree, but couldn't get very high. I threw rocks at other trees, trying to improve my aim. I made up stories in my head about being a survivalist living off the land. Around what I guessed was about 11 a.m., I ate one of my granola bars, rationing my food since I didn't know how long I'd be out there. Again, the plan was to stay out there for a full day. But the longer I was out, the more I kind of just wanted to go home. Around noon, I heard footsteps coming from deeper in the woods, not from the direction of my house. The steps sounded human, not like an animal. I thought it might be my parents searching for me, so I called out, "Mom!" The footsteps stopped immediately. Complete silence followed. The sudden stillness was unnerving, like I was being watched by everything in the forest. After that, I got a bit restless. I started to walk around a bit, still staying in the general area, but changing positions a few times. I found a small stream and followed it for a while, then circled back to my tree. Eventually, I sat down again, this time facing away from the house and deeper into the forest. About 2 hours later, my Game Boy batteries died in the middle of a battle. Disappointed, I looked up, and when I did, I nearly jumped out of my skin. Standing at the edge of the trees about 20 feet away from me was a figure that looked like my mom, or at least had her general shape and build. She was wearing what looked like the blue sweater my mom had put on that morning, but she was positioned in a way that her face was covered in shadows, and something about her stance felt wrong. Her arms hung a bit too low, and she was standing too still. I called out again, "Mom!" The figure nodded slowly and beckoned me with her hand. A similar "come here" gesture from years before. There was something about it, though. The movement was twitchy in a way. I got up and started to walk towards her, already feeling foolish about my plan to run away. I started to apologize, explaining that I was going to come back home, that I just wanted them to notice me more. I rambled on and on about how they never had time for me anymore, how they were always busy with each other or with work. The figure didn't respond, just turned and started to walk deeper into the woods, occasionally looking back and gesturing for me to follow. I followed, but something felt wrong. She was moving too quick, staying just far enough ahead that I couldn't get a good look at her. She never spoke, never responded to my apologies or questions. and she was leading me away from home into a part of the woods that I didn't recognize. The trees were thicker here, older with more underbrush that scratched up my legs through my jeans. "Why are you going so fast? Where are we going?" I called out, breaking into a jog to keep up with her. The figure didn't slow or respond, just kept the same pace, always just out of reach. The rational part of my brain started to send warning signals. Why would my mom ignore me? Why would she lead me deeper into the woods instead of just taking me home? But I kept following anyway, partly out of curiosity and partly because I didn't want to admit to myself that something was wrong. I started running, trying my hardest to catch up. I was focused entirely on the figure ahead of me. That's why I didn't see the drop-off until it was too late. The ground suddenly disappeared beneath my feet. I hadn't been watching where I was going, and I'd run straight over the edge of a steep ravine. I tumbled down, hitting rocks and branches before landing hard at the bottom. For a few terrifying seconds, I couldn't breathe. My chest felt compressed like someone was sitting on it. When my lungs finally started to work again, I gasped in air and immediately started to cough. My whole body ached. I checked myself for broken bones, moving each limb carefully. By some miracle, I was just badly scratched and bruised with a large gash on my arm that was bleeding, but not too deeply. If I'd fallen a little differently, I could have broken my neck. I could have died. Disoriented and scared, I looked around. The ravine was about 15 feet deep with steep sides of loose dirt and rock. At the bottom was a dry creek bed filled with stones and debris. I didn't recognize anything around me. I had never been this far into the woods before. I tried climbing back up the side I'd fallen down, but it was too steep and the dirt kept giving way under my feet. My shoes kept slipping on loose rocks, and I fell back down twice, scraping my hands and knees pretty bad. After about 15 minutes of failed attempts, I started to call for my mom and dad, hoping they were out there somewhere looking for me. I shouted until my throat hurt, then sat in silence for half an hour. I waited, listening, and hoping for a response. Nothing came back, but the occasional bird call or rustle of wind through the trees. I was crying. Then I walked to the other side of the ravine where the slope looked less steep, and I was able to climb out by grabbing onto tree roots and pulling myself up. My plan was to circle around to where the ravine was shallower on both sides, thinking I could find my way back home from there easily. But I quickly realized I was completely lost. Every direction looked the same, just trees and more trees with no landmarks I recognized. I tried to find the sun to get my bearings, but the forest canopy was too thick. I had no idea which way was north, which way was south, let alone which way led back to my house. I picked a direction and started to walk, hoping to find a trail or a road. Anything. I spent hours wandering, screaming for help, until my voice was gone. My feet hurt, my scratches stung, and I was getting increasingly desperate. The sun was setting, filtering through the trees in orange streaks, and panic really set in. I'd been in these woods at dusk before, but never this far, never alone. When night fell completely, the darkness was absolute. No streetlights, no house lights. I couldn't even see the moon through the trees. I tried using my flashlight, but the batteries were weak and it died after about 20 minutes. Now I was in complete darkness, stumbling around, tripping over roots and rocks. Eventually, I was exhausted and terrified, so I sat down against a tree trunk and cried myself to sleep. I don't know how long I slept, but I woke up and it was still dark. At first, I was disoriented still. I felt like I was sitting in someone's lap. My back was against something that wasn't the tree I'd fallen asleep against. There was a body beneath me, ice cold, someone's legs, like they'd been sitting in a freezer, though. Something sharp was moving across my cheek, like a nail or claw gently scraping my skin. The touch was almost tender, but it made my skin crawl. I looked up and saw what appeared to be my mother's silhouette, her familiar hair framing her face, and relief flooded through me. And I whispered, "Mom!" As my eyes adjusted to the dark, I saw that what I was looking at was not my mother at all. The face had a mouth, a wide stretched smile with no lips, but where the eyes, nose, and eyebrows should have been, there was nothing but smooth and pale skin stretched over her face. The smile widened as I looked at it, I screamed and scrambled away, my heart pounding so hard it could have burst. When I looked back, the figure was gone. I pressed my back against a real tree, trying to control my breathing, straining my eyes to see in the dark, terrified that thing would return. That's when I heard my father's voice in the distance calling my name. At first, I thought it might not be real, but the voice was unmistakably his. Deep and slightly hoarse. I'd know that voice from anywhere. I screamed back for him, my voice breaking. He yelled back to me to stay where I was and to just keep calling out. So I did just that, sobbing between shouts. 5 minutes later, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. I saw my parents running towards me along with 2 police officers and what looked like search and rescue volunteers. My mother ran to me and wrapped me in her arms, crying as hard as I was, while my dad kept saying, "Thank God, thank God." Over and over, one of the officers draped a blanket around my shoulders. I was shivering uncontrollably from cold and fear. I apologized repeatedly, telling them I had only meant to run away for a day, not to get lost like this. Through my tears, I mentioned the lady who had made me follow her and gotten me lost. They looked confused but didn't press me for details. Then my dad carried me back through the woods. It took almost an hour to reach our house, which showed how far I'd wandered. At home, paramedics checked me out, cleaning and bandaging my cuts, making sure I didn't have any infections. The police asked me some questions about why I had run away, but they were gentle about it. I overheard one of them telling my parents they were lucky. A kid my age lost in those woods overnight. Things could have ended much worse. Later that night, after the police left and I'd been cleaned up and fed, my parents sat on the edge of my bed and asked me about the lady I'd mentioned. I told them about how I thought it was Mom calling me into the woods, about following her to the ravine, about waking up in the lap of something that wasn't my mom and wasn't human. I described that faceless woman. I also told them about the night when I was 5, how it felt similar, and how I now believed the same thing had tried to lure me out the window. I could tell from their expressions they weren't sure whether to believe me, but they were clearly disturbed. Dad's face had gone a bit paler, and Mom kept making the sign of the cross, something she only did when she was truly scared. They made me promise never to go into the woods alone again, and told me that if I ever felt upset or neglected, I should just talk to them directly instead of running away. I kept that promise. I never went back into those woods by myself, and we moved away from that house a year later when Dad got a job in another state. Before we left, I overheard Dad talking to a neighbor about other kids who had gone missing in those mountains over the years. Some were found, some weren't. To this day, I don't know what that thing was. Why did it look like my mom? Why did it want me to go with her? I'm completely convinced it wanted to hurt me, tried to lead me into the woods out the window, and for some reason that didn't work. So, it waited for another opportunity when I was older. If you take anything away from this story, take 2 things actually. 1, don't be a silly goose kid and run away from your parents. Talk with them. And 2, don't follow strange entities into the woods of Appalachia. If you're enjoying the video, please subscribe the channel for future videos, and like and share with your friends. My wife and I started hunting together back in 2010, a year after we got married. We're both from rural Virginia, grew up in families where hunting was just part of life. Every fall, we take a week off work and head into the Appalachian Mountains for deer season. We had a small cabin that we rented from an old guy named Earl. I think he liked us because he charged us next to nothing as long as we brought him some venison jerky when we came back the following year. He was a great guy. We had plenty of normal hunting trips over the years, some successful but others not. But there were 2 trips, one in 2014 and the other in 2019, that I still can't explain. The first incident happened in November 2014. We'd been at the cabin for 3 days with no luck. We hadn't even seen a decent buck. On the 4th morning, we decided to try a new area about 2 miles north of our usual spot. This part of the woods was different. It had older trees, thicker undergrowth, and was oddly peaceful. We'd been in our blind for about 3 hours just after sunrise, when the air just sort of changed. It's the kind of thing that's hard to describe unless you've experienced it, but I think other hunters would know what I mean. It felt like the temperature dropped about 10 degrees in seconds, and there was a pressure in the air, like a storm was brewing. I remember looking at my wife and seeing she felt it, too. I asked her if she thought we should head back, and she nodded. Just as we were packing up our gear, we heard a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard in those woods before. Not a deer, a bear, or even a bobcat. It was high-pitched, reminding me of metal grinding against metal, and it echoed really well through the trees. My wife grabbed my arm and pointed to the ridge about 200 yards ahead of us. There we saw something moving through the tree line. I thought it was a person because it was walking upright on two legs, but the way it moved wasn't right. It was sort of robotic and too fast for someone navigating rough terrain. We only saw it for about 10 seconds before it disappeared behind the ridge. It was big, too, taller than a man, and we had seen what looked like wings on the thing with about a 15-foot wingspan. The wings weren't feathered but looked leathery, more like a bat's. The body was dark, either black or deep green, hard to tell in the shadows and from that distance. We didn't stick around much longer. We grabbed our things and got out of there as fast as we could without running. The whole way back to the cabin, we heard that metallic screeching, always seeming to come from a different direction. It sounded to me like we were being circled. When we made it back to the cabin, we tried to rationalize what we'd seen. I suggested it was some sort of large bird of prey, perhaps an eagle that looked bigger because of the angle or the light. My wife thought it could have been a hang glider, though we both knew there were no launch sites anywhere nearby. But we didn't want to admit how wrong it all felt. That night, Earl stopped by the cabin to drop off some firewood. My wife brought up what we'd seen, trying to keep it casual. Earl got real quiet, then asked exactly where we'd seen it. When we told him, he said that that area had a history of strange sightings going back over 100 years. Local folks called the creature the Snaly Gaster. According to him, it had been described as part reptile, part bird with tentacles and sometimes metallic parts. I thought Earl was just messing with us, telling us an old folktale. But the way he described the sound it would make, that metal-on-metal screeching, it matched exactly what we'd heard. And he seemed genuinely concerned, advising us to stay away from that part of the woods, especially at dawn and dusk. We finished our trip without incident, sticking to the safer hunting grounds Earl recommended. We didn't see anything unusual there, nor for the remainder of that season. Eventually, we convinced ourselves it had been some kind of large bird. Maybe combined with stress and poor visibility, we'd amped it up in our heads to something scarier. 5 years passed. We went back to those same woods every season, but we avoided the northern area where we'd had our strange encounter. Part of me had mostly forgotten about it, filed it away as one of those weird experiences you can't explain but don't dwell on much. And then came November 2019. It was our last day of the trip, and we'd had a good season. 2 nice big bucks between us. We decided to head out early in the morning to try for one more before going home. We went to a spot about a mile east of the cabin, an area we knew well. The morning was foggy, and visibility was maybe 50 yards at most. We'd been in our blind for about an hour when we started to hear rustling from a thicket about 40 yards ahead. I raised my rifle, expecting to see a deer emerging from the brush. What stepped out was no deer. It was roughly the size of a black bear, but the resemblance ended there. It had a long neck, and what I first thought was its head looked more like a beak. Not like a bird's beak, mind you, but something harder, almost metallic in the way it reflected the little bit of sunlight cutting through the fog. The creature had 4 legs, thick and powerful looking, but they bent weird, more like a reptile's than a mammal's. The strangest feature was what appeared to be tentacles or thick tendrils extending from its shoulders. There were at least 6 of them, constantly moving like they were tasting the air. My wife and I froze. We didn't speak and we didn't move. We could barely breathe. The creature seemed unaware of us, scanning the ground like it was looking for something, and we were determined to keep it that way. After what felt like forever, but honestly was probably only 30 seconds, it made that same metal grinding sound we'd heard 5 years prior, but softer, like it was talking to itself. But then it looked up sharply, directly toward our blind. I'm certain it couldn't see us. We were well concealed and downwind, but it seemed to sense something. My wife slowly raised her phone to try to take a picture. The movement was tiny, barely perceptible, but that creature reacted immediately. It reared up on its hind legs, standing almost 8 feet tall at its tallest, and spread those wings, but they weren't like a bird's. They were more like a bat's or even a dragon's from a movie, leathery and ribbed. It screeched again, so loud it hurt my ears, then lunged forward into the fog. Thankfully, not toward us, but parallel to our position. It moved incredibly fast, like it was gliding rather than running, and disappeared into the fog. We waited about 10 minutes, neither of us saying a word, before we decided to get back to the cabin. The whole way back, we kept scanning the trees and sky, expecting to see it again, but there was nothing. When we got back, my wife checked her phone, hoping she had managed to get a photo. But nope, she had never even clicked the button. Probably so scared she'd forgotten whether she had or not. We packed up and left early, not even waiting to say goodbye to Earl. On the drive home, we finally talked about what we'd seen, agreeing that it did match the description of the Snaly Gaster from local legends. The mix of bird and reptile features, the metallic elements, the tentacles. My wife was fascinated by this the further away we got. So she did some research. The Snaly Gaster has allegedly been part of Appalachian folklore since the 1700s, with reports peaking in the early 1900s when local newspapers actually ran stories about sightings. According to the legends, it has octopus-like tentacles, sharp teeth, and sometimes a metal beak, but it depends on who you ask. It's said to make a screaming metallic sound and will prey on livestock and people. Most accounts describe it as having leathery wings and a wingspan of up to 25 feet. Some even claim it has a single eye in the center of its forehead, though that was something that we could not confirm from what we saw. The thing that bothered me, though, was the consistency between our two sightings 5 years apart. Both times, the creature had the same distinctive features and made the same unusual sound. And both times, it seemed to be searching for something. I don't know if what we encountered was truly the legendary Snaly Gaster or some undiscovered species, but it doesn't fit any known animal I know of, and people out there still report seeing it from time to time. I grew up in a small hollow in the Appalachian Mountains. Our house sat at the end of a dirt road that turned to mud every time it rained. Dense forest loomed right behind it. My mom left when I was just 4 years old. I barely remember her, and I never knew my dad. His name wasn't even on the birth certificate. My grandparents raised me. They didn't have much money, but they made do. Grandpa worked in the coal mines until he got sick, then took odd jobs. Grandma grew vegetables in her garden and canned food for winter. We survived on Grandpa's disability checks and whatever animals he could hunt. One of my earliest memories is sitting on Grandpa's knee by the wood stove. He'd tell stories, dozens of them. Tales about the Cherokee who lived in these mountains before the white settlers came. Stories about feuds between families that stretched back generations. Legends about creatures that lived deep in the hollers where people rarely went, and for good reason. His favorite story was about the Appalachian Howler. The Howler, he'd say, his voice dropping low every time he said it, is older than these mountains, been here since before people, and it'll be here long after we're gone. He described it as something between a bear and a wolf, but larger than either, with a scream that could freeze your blood cold. According to Grandpa, the Howler only came out on nights when the moon was new and the sky was at its darkest. You'll know by its call, he'd say. Not like any natural thing you've ever heard. If you were outside at night and heard the Howler, you listened close. As long as it was howling, you were safe. But when the howling stopped, he'd always pause, making sure my eyes were wide. If the howling stops, it means it's found you. As a kid, I loved that story. It sent shivers down my spine in the best way. But there was something odd about the way Grandpa told it. Something in his eyes that didn't always match the playful tone in his voice. I noticed early on that both my grandparents acted differently when the moon was gone from the sky. They were careful people by nature, but on new moon nights, they were downright skittish. Grandma would check the locks 2 or 3 times. Grandpa would bring in extra firewood, more than we'd need for the night, and they were strict about me being inside before sunset on those nights. No sense taking chances, Grandma would say if I complained. That was always her answer. I was 8 years old the first time I heard the howler myself. It was late October, just before Halloween. The nights were getting longer, and there was a bite in the air that meant winter wasn't far behind. I'd been in bed for about an hour, not quite asleep yet, just watching the shadows from my nightlight dance across the ceiling. First, I thought it was the wind. We got pretty fierce winds in the fall sometimes, the kind that found every crack in our old house and moaned through them like a ghost. But this was different. It started low, almost too quiet to hear, then built up until it seemed to fill up the whole night. It wasn't like a wolf or coyote howl, those sounds I knew from living in the mountains. But this was very, very different. It was rough, like something with damaged vocal cords trying to make noise. The sound went up and down in a pattern that almost seemed like words I couldn't understand. It sent goosebumps racing across my skin, and I was up and out of that bed before I even realized I'd moved, running for my grandparents' room. I found them both already awake. Grandma was sitting on the edge of her bed, pulling on her robe. Grandpa was at the window, peering out through a crack in the curtains. "Hush!" Grandma said the moment I came around the corner. Before I had a chance to open my mouth, she held out her arms, and I ran into them, burying my face against her shoulder. "Is that?" I started to ask. "Don't you worry about it," she said, smoothing my hair. "Everything's going to be fine." But I could feel how tense she was. And when I looked up at Grandpa, I saw something I'd never seen on his face before. He was scared. He stepped away from the window and knelt down in front of me, putting his hands on my shoulders. "I'm going to go sit in the living room for a spell," he said. "You stay here with Grandma. You hear?" I nodded, and he kissed the top of my head before leaving the room. A minute later, he was back with his shotgun. The old double barrel that normally hung over the fireplace, something I thought was more of a decoration than a weapon most days. It wasn't the gun he hunted with. Grandma kept me in their bedroom, and we spent the night in there. She read stories, and we played Yahtzee while the howling went on outside. Bless her heart, she tried her best to act normal for me, to pretend we were just having a fun night. But she kept glancing at the window and jumped every time the howling got particularly loud. I remember thinking that it didn't sound like it was coming from any one place. Sometimes it sounded close, right outside the walls even. Other times it sounded distant, far up on the ridge. But it never fully stopped. Not until the sky began to lighten up with the first hint of dawn. The next morning, Grandpa was asleep in his armchair, shotgun across his lap. Grandma made pancakes for breakfast like it was a special occasion, and neither of them mentioned the sounds from the night before. When I tried to bring it up, Grandma just said, "Dear, some things we don't need to talk about in the light of day." After that, I always paid attention to the phases of the moon, always knew when the new moon was coming, and I always made sure I was inside before dark on those nights. Fast forward several years. I was 13 years old, awkwardly between child and teenager. Grandpa had passed away 2 years earlier. A stroke took him. Sorry if I get this wrong, but I think some sort of insurance claim or life insurance thing from the old mining job gave Grandma just enough money to pay off the house. And from there on, she was getting Social Security and using what little savings she had to live on. Since Grandpa's passing, we didn't hear the howler. Hadn't even talked about it. Part of me was starting to think it was just a story after all, something to keep me from wandering too far into the woods at night. The rational part of my brain said those howls had probably been some animal, a mountain lion, maybe. Could have been a bear, and Grandpa's stories had just made them seem more mysterious than they were. It was spring break, mid-April. My friend Tammy was staying over for the weekend. Tammy lived in town in one of those cookie-cutter houses with neighbors close enough to borrow sugar without leaving your yard. She loved coming out to our place, said it felt like a real adventure. We'd spent the day exploring the woods behind our house. We were deep in conversation about Dylan, a guy in class who we both had a massive crush on. Tammy was convinced he liked me. I was sure he was into her, though, and we went back and forth debating about stuff like that for hours. It wasn't until I noticed the light changing, the shadows getting longer, that I realized how late it had gotten. We should head back," I said, standing up and brushing dirt off my jeans. Tammy looked up, squinting at the sky visible through the tree canopy. That's not that late. Sun's still up, she said. Yeah, but it'll be dark by the time we get home if we don't go now. She rolled her eyes, but got up anyway, and we started back along the creek. We walked slowly, still caught up in our conversation about Dylan and whether his new haircut made him look more like Leonardo DiCaprio or not. We were maybe halfway back to the house when I heard a sound that I hadn't heard in about 5 years. A sound I recognized instantly. Low and gravelly at first, then rising into something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I stopped right in my tracks. My pulse raced. What's wrong?" Tammy asked. The howling came again. I remember the way she cocked her head around, listening to it. "What is that? Sounds like a big cat." "Tammy, we need to run," I said, and I grabbed her by the arm. "Like, right now, we need to get back to the house." Tammy laughed and shook my hand away. "Are you serious? It's just some animal. Probably a cougar in heat." "That's not a cougar," I explained. But even as the words left my mouth, I started to feel a flicker of doubt. Maybe it was just a mountain lion. Maybe Grandpa's stories and my own childhood fears had turned a normal animal sound into something supernatural. The howling came once more. It was getting closer, and Tammy raised an eyebrow. "See, just some horny cat," she said. And the way she said that, so confident, so dismissive, it made me feel stupid for being scared. "Yeah, maybe," I said, relaxing a little. "But still, we should get back. Grandma will be wondering where we are." We started to walk again, faster than before, but still not running. Part of me was still listening to the sound, trying to compare it to the memory I had. Was it really the same, or had I just built it up in my mind over years? We were nearing the edge of the woods, maybe a quarter mile from home, when the howling stopped. I felt that silence like it was an actual weight on my back. At the same time, the woods got quiet, just complete silence where there should have been noise. "Tammy," I said quietly, "we need to run now." She must have heard something in my voice because this time she wasn't arguing. We started to jog along the path, the fading light making it harder to see where we were putting our feet. We'd gone about 50 yards when something landed on the ground behind us with a thud heavy enough to vibrate my bones. We froze, then slowly turned around. The path behind us was dark. The trees overhead blotted out what little light was left in the sky. But I could hear something breathing, deep and heavy breathing. "Run," I whispered. And this time, Tammy didn't need any convincing. We tore down that path. I could hear something behind us moving faster than any person could run. And I knew we were in trouble. In moments, we burst out of the tree line, and I could see my house in the distance, a warm yellow light glowing in the kitchen window. As we broke from the cover of the trees, a sound like a gunshot split the air. A bit of bark burst from a tree not 3 feet from where we stood. I screamed, thinking for a wild second that whatever was chasing us had some kind of weapon. But then I saw Grandma standing in the yard. She was holding and pointing Grandpa's shotgun. "Run," she was screaming. "To the house now." We ran like our lives depended on it because in that moment, I truly believed they did. We made it to the porch, and Grandma was there grabbing us and shoving us through the door. Then she slammed it behind us and threw the deadbolt. "What were you thinking?" she demanded. I can remember how pale her face was. Her hands were shaking as she leaned the shotgun against the wall. "Being out this late tonight of all nights." I'm sorry, I gasped. We lost track of time. I didn't realize it was a new moon. Grandma closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath. When she opened them again, she looked calmer. "You're safe now. That's what matters." Tammy was looking between us, confused and still scared. "What's going on? What was that?" Grandma looked at her for a long moment, then sighed. "Come with me. Let's go sit somewhere more comfortable. I'll make some hot chocolate and we can talk." We ended up in Grandma's bedroom just like that night years ago. Soon she brought in hot chocolate and cookies, and we were sitting on her bed while she took the rocking chair. "What your grandpa used to tell you about the Howler," she said, looking at me. "It wasn't a story," I said quietly. "What Howler?" Tammy asked. So I told her the story from memory, The way Grandpa had told it to me all those years ago about how it only came out on the darkest nights. How its howl was a warning and how silence meant danger. That's what was out there? Tammy asked when I finished. That's what was chasing us? Grandma nodded. I've lived in these mountains my whole life and I've only seen it twice. Once when I was about your age. And again tonight. You saw it tonight? I asked. Just a glimpse, she said. When you girls came out of the trees, I saw something right behind you. It was big, covered in hair, moving in a way that no natural critter moves. She shook her head, explaining that she'd fired a shot at it but missed, and how she was so panicked and worried for a split moment that she might have shot us, but luckily hadn't. But it did seem to scare the thing off. Within the hour, the howling had started up again, distant at first, then moving around the perimeter of our property like it was pacing. We stayed up late into the night playing Yahtzee, of course, and talking, trying to pretend we weren't listening to the sound. The next morning, Tammy's parents came to pick her up as planned. I was afraid she wouldn't want to come back after that. But as she was leaving, she leaned in and whispered, "That was the most exciting sleepover ever. Wait till I tell everyone at school." "Don't. They'll think we're crazy," I told her. She grinned. "It'll be our secret then. Besides, I definitely want to come back. Maybe not on a new moon, but I'll come back." After that night, Grandma established a new rule. No going outside after 4 p.m. on new moon days. No exceptions. I didn't question it. Even now, I find myself checking the moon phase before I make plans. Old habits die hard, I guess, but better than dying in the woods, you know. I got a job in the city after high school and never found my way home for more than short visits. Whenever I do go back, I drive up that winding road to the house where I grew up and I keep a good eye on the trees, whether it's day or night. Growing up, bonfires were pretty much a staple of our family gatherings. My uncle, who I referred to as Lester for this story, was especially fond of them. He'd come over at least once a month when the weather was good, bring a cooler of Budweiser, and stack wood for a fire that would burn well into the night. The gatherings were usually just my parents, Uncle Lester, sometimes his on-again, off-again girlfriend Sherry, and a rotating cast of neighbors or coworkers my dad would invite. They'd sit in lawn chairs around the fire drinking beer, and Uncle Lester would eventually pull out his beat-up acoustic guitar. He wasn't particularly good, but after everyone had a few beers, nobody seemed to mind. As a kid, I was rarely allowed to stay out there for the whole thing. Mom would let me hang around till about 9. I would roast marshmallows and listen to the grown-ups talk, but then it was bedtime. I'd argue every time, but it never worked. There was drinking and what my mom called adult conversation, which was basically just them cussing more freely and telling stories I probably shouldn't hear. There was one night that stuck in my memory. I must have been around 8. It was summer, and I'd been sent to bed as usual while the bonfire was still going strong. My bedroom window faced the backyard, so I could still hear them laughing and talking. I remember just lying awake and listening to them. Eventually, the voices dwindled as people headed home or went to bed, but I could still hear my dad and Uncle Lester out there, their voices low as they kept drinking by the fire. I was almost asleep when I heard something different. Yelling, not angry, but alarmed, and the sound of people running around the yard. I got up and looked out the window, but it was too dark to see much beyond the glow of the dying bonfire. I could hear them running across the yard, laughing, but also a little scared, and then the back door slammed open and shut. There was some running inside the house and the sound of the door being locked. After a moment of silence, I heard both Dad and Uncle Lester suddenly burst into laughter. That kind of uncontrollable laughter where you can barely catch your breath. I rolled my eyes, thinking they were silly, and eventually went to sleep. This became one of those odd childhood memories that surfaces on occasion but eventually fades with time. Fast forward, I'm 35 now with my own family. We were having Uncle Lester over recently for dinner. It was movie night, and the kids wanted to watch Sonic the Hedgehog. Lester was getting up there in age, but he loved coming to see the kids. He was gray-haired now, but still had that same mischievous grin. He sprawled out on my couch with a beer in hand. About halfway through the movie, something triggered that old memory. Not sure what it was, but yeah. I said, "Hey, Uncle Lester, remember those bonfires you guys used to have at my parents' place?" He nodded his head and swigged his beer, saying, "Those were good times." I said to him, "I remember this one night when I was a kid. I remember hearing you and Dad running into the house like something was chasing you. I heard you laugh too, but you also sounded a bit creeped out." Lester's eyebrows shot up. Then a slow smile spread across his face. "Holy crap, you remember that?" We looked at the kids, who were thankfully absorbed in the movie. Sorry. Wow, I can't believe you remember that night. I was wanting to know what happened to you too." He laughed and shook his head. "Well, you won't believe it, but whatever." He took another drink, then went on. "Your dad and I were the last ones out there drinking too many beers, telling work stories. Anyway, we were sitting there, fire burning low, and we're pretty well buzzed. Then, out of nowhere, and believe me or not, it's your choice, this little man comes running out of the woods." "A little man?" I laughed. "Yep, not a kid, a man but tiny, maybe 2.5 feet tall. He was wearing a pointed green hat and had a long nose. And his ears," he gestured with his hands. "They had these big lobes stretched out like those folks who use gauges in their ears or whatever." He came running straight at us, mad as heck, yelling in some language I couldn't understand. Sounded like he was cursing up a storm, though. You can tell when someone's cursing you out, no matter what language it is. "You're pulling my leg," I told him. "Swear to God," Lester said, even holding his hand up like he was taking an oath. "Ask your dad next time you see him. That little fella chased us around the fire pit." We were scared, crapless, but also laughing because it was so dang weird. Finally, we made a break for the house and locked the door behind us. I asked him what he thought it was. "Look, nobody around here is that small. Not even the kids. And this wasn't no kid. Your dad and I discussed it well after. Thought maybe we imagined it or mistook some sort of small animal for it. Even so, we both described the same thing." I wasn't sure what to say after that. It sounded like they got pretty drunk and probably imagined it. But Uncle Lester thought it was real. He says he never saw anything like it before or since. We went out there the next morning to look around, hungover and everything, but there was nothing. No footprints, not a trace. The kids cheered at something on the TV, breaking the moment. Lester winked at me and turned back to the movie. "Oh boy,